and Tale Blue. C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live beginning at 7 a.m. Eastern, Sunday morning. Join the discussion.
The Muslim Public Affairs Council hosted a discussion on national security and civil rights. This was part of their annual convention in Los Angeles. It's 40 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Salam. For those of you I don't know, my name is Seema Ahmad. I'm the chair of the board of directors for the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Thank you so much for joining us. I am personally thrilled about the panel discussion we have lined up first for you. I'm going to do very brief introductions of each of our speakers, kick it off with a couple questions, and then we're going to hear them have a conversation about the issue of policing and national security on one hand and civil rights and civil liberties on the other. So immediately to my left is Professor Jody Armour. He's a chaired professor of law at USC, teaching torts and criminal law, and he's written and spoken extensively about the criminal justice system, race, mass incarceration, and we're really thrilled to have you, Jody. Thank you. And next to Professor Armour is Mike Downing, former deputy chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. Mike was with LAPD for 35 years, recently retired, but gave his entire, professional career to the department, and is a very, very special friend of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and of our community, Mike, and we really appreciate you being here today. I'm going to kick it right off and start with a question to you, Mike. You hear stories in the American Muslim community of families who, let's say, have a son or a daughter that they think is potentially involved in something nefarious or has traveled overseas and they don't know where their son went, or they think they've fallen into the wrong crowd, and these well-meaning parents take it upon themselves to contact the FBI or federal law enforcement out of really a source of desperation that they don't know where their child is. And the next thing that they experience is that their son is slapped with a terrorism prosecution and is looking at spending the rest of his life in a federal prison. That's the reality of some of the stories that we've seen coming out of these terrorism cases. And so the question I have for you, Mike, is given that sort of environment, given those stories and given that dynamic, and given that law enforcement is institutionally positioned for intercepting terrorism cases and crime, can there be trust between the American Muslim community and law enforcement? And if so, how?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so this is actually the first time I'm speaking as a civilian. So I don't have a badge and I don't have a gun on, and I'm really kind of liberated now. I mean, not that I ever held back in terms of what I thought or advocated on this issue, but for so long we've always said that there's got to be some middle ground here. There's got to be something in between the prevention and the interdiction and prosecution. And, we learned some really hard lessons. Connie Rice has actually helped teach us many of these lessons with the whole gang epidemic that, we thought that we could arrest our way out of the problem. The declaration of the war on gangs, you can't declare war on your own citizens, for one. Secondly, it wasn't really until we saw that there was some middle space, some ability to intervene, to teach, to talk about character development, youth development, job placement, mental health resources, things like that. And I know the criticism in this space has been that, when this happens, it's almost this agent provocateur type of strategy where, sometimes there's a perception that law enforcement has taken some of these individuals to places they never dreamed of going. And so I think there is opportunities to intervene from a community side and also from a law enforcement side. Now, will it happen with the law enforcement side? It's going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot of deposits being, a lot of credits in the bank for good things that are happening in the community to build up that trust. And right now it's probably not there in this space. But law enforcement and community trust, it's really about relationships and relational. It's not so much transactional, it's transformational. And we've learned over time that, you know, anything could happen anywhere in the United States with a law enforcement agency, and it doesn't matter if it happened in New York or Washington, D.C., but we feel it here because it says it's all of law enforcement. So I think that there's a lot of work to do in this space. I know that LAPD has developed an intervention program that is owned by the mental health discipline. So it's really not law enforcement centric, but law enforcement is involved in it. Is it being used? Certainly not as much as it can be used. Certainly not as much as MPAC's program, Safe Spaces. But I think that as this continues to evolve, and unfortunately, as this threat continues to evolve, it's going to get worse before it gets better, as we've seen. You know, we had our first vehicle ramming incident in Manhattan, where for the first time since 9/11 there have been casualties in a terrorist attack in New York, and I think that is kind of the decentralization of the threat that we're seeing across Europe, Africa, and the United States. But we've always said that communities are our strength, and what we can do to exploit that and leverage that and build trust in that space is just crucial, because it can't be us against them. It's got to be a collaborative effort. We have a long way to go, and this relationship is very fragile. But I'm very hopeful, because I think that there's a lot of people in my business that you know, the team that I left, they completely understand this issue, and they know that outreach and engagement and problem solving in all areas, not just terrorism, earthquake preparedness, fire hazards, crime, narcotics, gangs, all that, when it becomes routine and natural, then we don't have this white elephant in the room that we're afraid to talk about.
Thank you, Mike. Jody, let me turn it to you and see if you have any thoughts on kind of what Mike has said, especially any comparatives to the work you've done on the criminal justice system and prosecution and relationships with law enforcement.
Yeah, well, we have to be clear that when we call on law enforcement to intervene in a situation like you're describing, and you're hoping that they'll intervene in a beneficent way, that a lot of times you're calling on a punitive expression from the state, because a lot of what's happening on the street with handcuffs and automatic weapons is often a kind of punitive take on, for example, downtown on Skid Row, right around the corner from here. In 2006, we started the Safer Cities Initiative. And the city of LA deployed an additional 80 officers in the nickel, making LA one of the most heavily policed neighborhoods, the most heavily policed urban area in the nation. And at the time they were doing that, they were under a consent decree that said you had to end the kind of paramilitary approach, the zero tolerance approach, which they did in places like South Central, et cetera, but not on Skid Row with the Safer Cities Initiative. Instead, they went to a zero tolerance, broken windows approach, and were citing people and putting them in handcuffs and having them appear to take care of that citation by simply going to one of the mega shelters and entering a 12-step program that would repair you as an individual. Because, of course, the reason you're on the street is because you're broken inside. You have an internal deficiency. It's part of the culture of poverty, a thesis that started back with Moynihan and before, really with Michael Harrington in his book, The Other America, and has carried forward with our thinking that what poor people have is a pathology that needs to be cured in some way. And so what you wound up with there was a punitive approach to poverty governance, using the police force to step in and issue, and the citations are there. The numbers won't lie. The number of citations and arrests for all kinds of very minor infractions, the taking of people's property, the courts had to step in and say, you can't constitutionally do that, right? That's invading their dignity too much, right? But it was all in the name not of retribution, retaliation, revenge, but therapy. It was therapeutic, paternalistic punitiveness, right? And whenever we bring police in to solve a problem, just recognize it has the potential. It's punitive by nature, almost. All right, when it comes in, it doesn't have to be. Unfortunately, the approach I'm talking about has turned police officers into street-level social workers, who are making therapeutic decisions about rather than seeing poverty as a problem of a lack of jobs. Skid Row is a problem of a lack of jobs and affordable housing. Macro-level external factors, we focus on their internal brokenness, right, which absolves us. Now, not that there aren't people who need health care and need mental health care, up to 45% of Skid Row, but that leaves another 50 to 55% who don't fit that mold, yet we're treating them with this coercive benevolence, right? So I would just say as a general matter, I worry when it comes to, in cases like you're talking about, asking the police to come in a beneficent role, right, to resolve an issue. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying you can understand the skepticism, and we need to build that trust. So I can feel like I can call the police officer to help me with my son or daughter, who's missing, without him using stereotypes about my son or daughter and people I'm from against them when they are supposed to be intervening on their behalf. Right, and police are people too, and all people have biases. All people have unconscious stereotypes and prejudice, so they're going to naturally find their way. They're going to express themselves in police work, and it takes constant vigilance to keep that down.
Do you want to respond, Mike?
Yeah, I think, well, in this case, we had to do something because the community didn't really know what to do, and they knew that if they called the FBI to say, hey, my son or daughter's in the basement, been watching videos, changed their dress, their appearance, their decor, I don't know what to do, they'd see prosecution. So, law enforcement, unfortunately, is called upon to solve many, many of society's issues, and we want to help. That's our nature. We're public servants. And so that's why we kind of put mental health, Department of Mental Health, as the lead in this, but with the law enforcement up at the table so that we can offer alternatives. I'm not saying it's the silver bullet. I'm not saying it's the final, solution to this problem, but it's law enforcement's way of saying, look, it's not just about pursuit. It's not just about locking somebody up. It's not just about a rule-based society. It's about this balance between a care-based approach and a law, the rule of law-based approach, and to show that we are part of the community, we care about the community, we want the community's input, and we want the community to be engaged with us in this problem-solving approach, so that it just doesn't become a rule-based centered, a method for cops to do their work. I think for the sustainability of even law enforcement, they need that for their own psychology. They need the community's input. They need to be engaged with families because they have families themselves, so that it's not a soldier containing through force and fear, but it's a public servant that is involved in inspiring values, protecting values, education, creating this inspiration in communities. So I think for the sustainability of law enforcement institutions, they need that kind of feedback. It can't just be about responding to radio calls and arresting people. There's got to be this transformational relationship with communities.
Do you have something, Jody?
Yeah, one issue I don't want us to miss having an opportunity to talk some about is profiling. All right, since that is so central to the experience of so many black folks, so many Muslims, so many immigrants, Latinos, et cetera. Right. So there are a lot of socially marginalized groups who have to struggle with being profiled not only by law enforcement but by private vendors, taxi cabs, storekeepers, across the social range of experiences that you can have. And my concern is that officers, again, being just people too, right? A lot of people think that it is okay to profile people if there's a statistically rational basis for the profiling, right? If they'll say, oh, if there's a statistically rational relationship, for example, between crime and race, why can't I consider someone's race when I'm trying to assess the dangerousness of an ambiguous person? I consider their gender. Yes. I consider their age, someone 18 versus 90. Yes. Do I consider their disability status? Yes. Whether they're in a wheelchair or not? Yes. Right? Why can't I consider race as just one additional rationally related factor to an assessment I'm trying to make, right? And that is the heart of profiling, right? That's statistically rational. When somebody like Jesse Jackson says, nothing more troubles me, to an all-black congregation, nothing more troubles me at this point in my life than to walk down the street, hear suspicious footsteps, start thinking robbery, turn around, see a white face, and feel relieved, right? When Jesse Jackson says that, what he's getting at is the fact that if you take a group of people and disproportionately concentrate them in desperate circumstances, it should sadden but not surprise you to find them disproportionately turning to desperate undertakings like crime. You plunk them down in criminogenic conditions, no surprise that crime rates are higher, right? But then what does that mean, for law enforcement, for example? If it's rational to consider race, quote unquote, should law enforcement consider it in any way when they're making their assessments of ambiguous people under different circumstances, right? And I just want to make sure that we put that to bed, right? Show that that argument should cut no ice, carry no water with us, and here's why it shouldn't. And therefore, an officer should internalize this morality when it comes to treating people equally in discharging their obligations. Ira Glasser, ACLU president, some years back, tells a story of a black couple taking in a movie in Times Square in the early 70s when Times Square was a little different place than it is now. It was more of a mixed-use kind of place. Right, not, Disney family friendly like now, right? But it was mixed use. And there was a black doctor and his wife, 5 months pregnant, were finished watching a movie at 11 p.m., came out. It was raining. He told her he'd get the car, wait under the marquee. When he got back, she'd been arrested. She was gone. He discovered she'd been arrested, strip searched, and booked for loitering with the intent to prostitute. All right, let's assume, perhaps counterfactually, but let's assume that at the time the officer made that arrest, a disproportionate amount of prostitution activity was taking place between the hours of 10 and 2 a.m. The disproportionate amount of it was being carried on in Times Square. That a disproportionate amount of it was being carried on by unescorted women. And that a disproportionate amount of it was being carried on by women of color. Let's say all that above is true. Then he would say, oh, I made a rational determination. Or it was a rational inference that I drew. It was rational judgment, right? Rational profiling, right? The reason we don't buy that, though, the reason we find what he did so odious, even if he's able to say it was in some sense rational, is given the social consequences of error, if he's mistaken, given that there is some risk of error, right, and is a judgment, and given the social consequences of that, if that risk of error is realized, he should have waited longer, reduced the risk of error more before acting on that belief. He should have waited until he saw more people come along, for example. He should have done more, right, to make sure, because it's not just about rational, it's about reasonable. Rational and reasonable are not the same thing. He may have rational grounds, but his actions aren't reasonable, because to make a reasonableness determination, you have to make a value judgment. You're balancing competing interests. You can't reduce reasonable to rational. And anybody who's making profiling discussions, whenever they enter it, you keep bringing that home. Rational ain't reasonable. I want to hear about statistical rationality of standing alone. Yes, we all consider that. Like I said, gender. We consider gender. right? A lot of times in an ambiguous situation at night, or an ability status or other kinds of things, right? But don't think that resolves the issue in any way. That I just kind of wanted to. Now, getting officers to adopt that, to say, now I realize that even though it's statistically rational to consider this factor, I'm not going to, because I'm going to do constitutional policing. I'm going to let certain value judgments keep me from falling into ordinary human propensities like considering that factor.
Well, if I could bring that back to Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Muslim communities, profiling is wrong. It's illegal. It's despicable. But what we've always talked about with, for example, the suspicious activity reporting campaign, when we first came out the campaign, many people in the community were up in arms about this. You're profiling us, it's about what we're wearing, it's about what we believe in, it's about how we look. And so we actually gave the whole campaign and program to MPAC. Aziza Hassan, Salam Ahmadiyati, there was a whole team there that looked at it. They critiqued it. They said, look, we don't like this part of it. This is what you could do better. We adopted, I think, 98% of the recommendations, and we published it. We turned it into a special order. And basically the theme was, we don't believe in profiling. This is not about profiling people. It's about profiling behavior. And if that behavior is criminal or suspicious as it relates to pre-operational planning or any kind of terrorist planning, that's what we need to know about. That's what we need to report about. The reason I brought that up is because this was a problem-solving issue that the police and the community did together. And we could go ahead and dictate and have this program, but if the community's not invested in it, there's no value in it. So we had something that the community said, this is really from us, this is our critique. We took it, we published it, we educated and taught it. And I'm trying not to be Pollyanna about this because I know there are instances where their profiling takes place. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've disciplined officers for it. But part of getting over that is to have this community buy-in, this community participation in the problem-solving effort. Because we could have taken our ideas and turned them into a special order and educated our police officers on how to carry it out, but you would still have been suspicious about it. As it is now, some people are still suspicious about it. But at least there's policy that says we don't believe in profiling people. We do believe in profiling behavior that could be criminal or potentially criminal.
Mike, let me interject with a question, Jody, and then we'll get to you. As I'm hearing you talk, I'm picturing if I was a young Muslim man, a teenager or in my 20s, and I have nothing to do with criminal behavior. I have nothing to do with issues around national security. I mean, the cases that we're talking about are who knows what percent of relevance to the vast majority of the Muslim community. We don't have some, not that you're suggesting it, but we don't have some, there are no secret cells, there are no interconnectedness between all of us. We are just going to work, taking care of our families, going to school. And my question on a more psychological, I think, standpoint is this lens of being viewed through national security. Even when it comes to partnership, the partnership is still through the lens of national security. I guess my question for you, Mike, is what are your thoughts about sort of how that can affect our young people and what we can do to mitigate that trauma?
Yeah, I think it stigmatizes young people, and it's really heartbreaking to see young people have this identity crisis, to not be able to articulate what it is to be an American Muslim, what that identity means, and what value that brings to the rest of our society. So I think over time, I've been engaged with the Muslim American communities for the past 11 years in my work. Prior to 9/11, to me, it was an invisible community. In fact, when I was a young police officer and that mosque was built right outside USC, we were told, don't go anywhere near it. You're not allowed in there. There was just this very mysterious, so we were always kind of saying, wow, I don't know what goes on in there, but so when I got into this business, it was just like I did with any other community, with the LGBTQ community, with the African American community, the Hispanic community. I didn't get put in counterterrorism because of my intelligence background. I got put in counterterrorism because of my ability to see the value in bringing communities together, because I knew they were our strength. And so the conversation needs to move beyond terrorism. Look, terrorism in our country is still a low volume but high consequence threat. We're going to see it, not as much as Europe. We're going to continue to see it. But look, we need to prepare for earthquakes, for fires, for floods, for the physical environment of our communities, what the alleys look like, the street lighting, cleaning up the graffiti. Those kinds of discussions are what we need to really protect. And in the words of Dr. Maher Hathout, who, I always looked at him as the Martin Luther King of the Muslim communities. He said, God forbid they blow up our bridges and blow up our buildings. We can rebuild those, but what we really need to protect is the values that keep us why we came here in the first place. The values of equality, as Connie Rice said, the rule of law, the Constitution. Those are the things we really need to protect, and with our young people, to really understand what it is to be American, and to have all those rights amongst us, and to understand the civil nature of all that, but to participate. So I would ask in these town hall meetings, I would say, well, how many of you are involved in the Community Police Advisory Board? How many of you are involved in the cadet program? How many are involved in Neighborhood Watch, in Chambers of Commerce, in those organizations where we really need to have your voice, listen to your voice, participate in this greater idea, find ways to lead beyond the walls of your own institution. Don't be isolated. And I think that will help. Terrorism and crime and narcotics is not the enemy. Complacency is the enemy.
Thank you, Mike. Jody?
I like your way of framing the question, because you're saying, do we start by looking at these people through a lens of security or through a lens of civil rights? Where do we start? And why not? We too often don't start with the lens of civil rights, with the constitutionally protected, I have a right to be treated as an individual and not profiled, for example, right? And that right is actually rooted in the Constitution for a reason, because it's supposed to resist the siren call of fears about security and safety. That's why it's in the Constitution, right? The reason for a constitutional right is like Ulysses tying himself to the mast, right? Tying himself to the coil, protecting this self from a later baser self, this higher self. When he's responding to the higher angels of his nature, he says, we should respect individual rights even when it's costly and inconvenient. Damn it, we should respect them. Right? That's what a constitutional right says. You're tying yourself to the mast. And the problem is, too often you have jurisprudence and lawyers and judges and others in law enforcement who are hacking away at Ulysses' self-imposed coils in the name of siren justice. Listen to that warble from the rocks about expediency and convenience and security and safety, and start to sacrifice all these individual rights for that. That's what's warbling from the rocks, right? And too many are hacking away at his coils in the name of siren justice. Right? And we have to keep on bringing home that that's what it means to constitutionally police, to be motivated, animated, driven by this respect for constitutional rights, even when it's inconvenient, even when it is damn burdensome. That's why we call it a constitutional right.
Great.
Thank you, Jody. I have a related question based on some of your work. You've written about communities of color, black communities. You've proposed the idea that, if I could paraphrase it correctly, that in some black communities there is the idea of the sort of good black man and the bad black man. And the bad black man is poor, maybe he's got a record, maybe he doesn't have a job, and the good black man maybe lives in your neighborhood, is middle class or upper middle class, and so there's a separation within the community between good and bad. And I'd like to propose an idea that maybe that can happen in the Muslim community as well, that a good Muslim is an assimilated Muslim, someone maybe who speaks a certain way or looks a certain way or acts a certain way socially or at work. And I'd like you to comment on that theory that you've posited, maybe comment on how you've seen that play out in the black community, and what lessons are there for the American Muslim community to not fall into the trap of our community getting more and more divided internally.
Yeah, well, and certainly in the black community, I've had my neighbors come to me. For example, I live in View Park in what LA Times referred to several months ago as the Black Beverly Hills. Right? You got a lot of upper middle class black folk who live in View Park, Baldwin Hills, Windsor Hills. And I've had my neighbors come to me and tell me when I've had my gatherings at my house, my sons, my 3 sons all played Pop Warner football, Little League baseball, AAU basketball, so they made friends all over the city, you know, in all places far flung. So when their friends would visit them, I've had neighbors come to me and say, we don't want Compton up here. And I've had a sheriff's deputy tell my event planner, we don't want South Central up here, even though we live in South Central, but up here, right, but up here, right? And there is this politics of respectability approach that you find in the black community, and I think there are analogs for lots of communities who are dealing with us-them divides within the community. Within the black community, it's been a lot of times along lines defined by law enforcement. That is, good Negroes and bad Negroes. Aunt Randall Kennedy, a black law professor at Harvard Law School, wrote a book, Race, Crime, and Law in '97, in which he exhorted the black community to practice a politics of respectability in criminal matters by distinguishing between good Negroes and bad Negroes. Good Negroes were law-abiding blacks. Bad Negroes were blacks caught up in the criminal justice system in any way, right? And Chris Rock, and we're ready, we get to speak frankly now, right? Chris Rock launched his comedic career, since people are often putting a mic in front of him for social commentary, especially on racial justice issues. Well, here's how he launched his comedic career. He walked back and forth in front of a mostly black audience and said, and let me see if I can remember the routine. I'm going to try to do it pretty close, just the first few lines. It's like a civil war going on in black America, and there's 2 sides. There's black people and there's niggas. And niggas have got to go. I love black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Shit, I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he went on like that for 45 minutes. And his core definition of an N-word, a nigga, was a black who's done a crime. So according to that definition that he was inviting us to engage in, right, he was saying that the up to 90% in some of our neighborhoods, when I put this in my latest article, they had me pinpoint cited. They said, Professor, this sounds hyperbolic. Up to 90% of young black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods are going to wind up in jail on probation, on parole at some point in their lives. So he's saying up to 90% of them are niggas? Yes. Do the math, right? Plain and simple, right? And that particular distinction may seem like a moral distinction, but when you look at the middle-class black crime rates and the middle-class white crime rates, they're the same, roughly the same. So most of those bad Negroes are coming from the ranks of truly disadvantaged black, the vast majority. So what you have is really a class distinction masquerading as a moral distinction. That's what you really have. That's why they were saying, keep Compton out of here. We don't want South Central up here. They were practicing spatial profiling, right? We, the black bourgeoisie, we who are always railing against racial profiling, practice spatial profiling ourselves. right, when we got the chance. So, yeah, that is a kind of politics that's finally been under assault for the last 3 to 4 years, really. Black Lives Matter has made it a part of their agenda to attack any politics of respectability in criminal matters. They said, just because a person took a loaf of bread doesn't mean you get to shoot them in the back 5 times. We're not going to play respectability politics. With these lies, like Bill Cosby did when he, got that 2004 Image Award, and he said, the famous pound cake speech, infamous. People are crying about that black kid getting shot over the pound cake. Why did he take the pound cake? I've been hungry. I've looked in the window. I didn't take the pound cake. You know why? Something called upbringing, right? So you got that kind of moralizing coming from a first-degree hypocrite like him, who was spiking women, slipping Mickeys into women's drinks. Some comedian called him Pill Cosby, right? But he's going to moralize all of these bad Negroes and represent Huxtable, the black bourgeoisie. So yeah, that is how that us, them, good Negro, bad Negro is played out. Politics of respectability and criminal matters in the black community.
Thank you, Jody. Our time has flown by, so I want to just give the closing couple of minutes to Mike to close out your thoughts, and then you'll both be here for folks to speak with you more in more detail. Thank you, Mike.
No, thank you. It's so good to see all of you today. Over the 10 years that we worked together, I saw times where we ebbed and flowed, and there were some good times, some struggling and challenging times. But I oftentimes think that it's probably good to prepare us for what is to be the future. And I think we're in for some real challenging future now with the way politics are going, with the way society in general is going, with the way the evolution of this threat is evolving. But always remember that this is our strength. You are our strength. All the communities throughout our country are our strength, and never let anybody demonize or isolate or silo any community, because this is your right to speak out. And as much as possible, I would engage in organizations outside of what you normally do. Join the chambers of commerce, join the neighborhood watch groups, join the police advisory boards, get on commissions, find ways to, I don't like that word assimilate. That is just a word that I've often just stayed away from, because if we assimilate, we're all going to be like each other. And the strength of our country is not that. The strength of our country is this diversity that we have, and we should appreciate the food, the fashion, the beliefs, the cultures, the lifestyles, and find ways so our youth can also see that and appreciate that. I think that we have an opportunity to be a model for the rest of the world if we get it right. We have a lot of work to do in this country, and keep fighting, and remember that terrorism and crime and narcotics and gangs isn't the enemy. Complacency is the enemy.
Thank you both so very much. Thank you.